Honorable External Affairs Minister, Excellencies the Minister, distinguished guests, ambassadors, scientists, I must particularly recognize Dr. James Beecham. I'm relatively fascinated by some of his talks, especially the one which talks about on the other end of the black hole, delivered in Royal Institution in June 22. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of government and my ministry, Ministry of External Affairs, it is indeed a privilege to welcome you all to the 9th edition of the Raisina Dialogue. Raisina, already a brand globally, its ever-growing attraction and relevance clearly points to its contributions in effective shaping of global discourse on geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geotechnology. Your presence and participation in this year's edition of Raisina testifies to its continuing success. Tonight's session is titled Looking Back, Looking Ahead, the Long Decade. While opening his lecture, which I just referred to, on the other side of a black hole, delivered, as I said, in June 22, Professor James Beecham, while talking about what causes gravity, says, this is just the beginning of his lecture there, at first you would not notice anything. Then, suddenly, everything would change, radically and violently. First 4 years of this decade give us a similar feeling. It has indeed been a long decade. We are not even halfway through, and we have already witnessed a once-in-a-century pandemic, re-emergence of conflict in Europe and Middle East, aggressive intent and destabilizing actions in the Indo-Pacific, belligerent activity on the Red Sea, rising food, fertilizer, energy, and supply chain insecurities, often a consequence of conflict and aggression, weaponization of trade, investment, technology, and financial flows, stalled globalization, and a strong sense in the global south that it has been left to fend for itself. And just when the world needs it the most, multilateral institutions, particularly the UN system, only offer us discord and dysfunction. Clearly, enough of pessimism going around. But that need not be our defining frame of reference. Instead, our choice could be to create constructs that are rooted in optimism for the future, for our future, are based on democratic values, respect sovereignty and territorial integrity of nations, are inclusive in their approaches, are underwritten by development cooperation template that does not burden countries with debt, that shape global commons for global good, that draw from Mother Earth only what we need, not as per our greed. India, under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, captured the essence of this construct in India's G20 presidency's theme of One Earth, One Family, One Future. This is our belief as also our endeavor. We firmly believe that in years ahead, Prime Minister Modi's vision to make India a developed nation by 2047 and a $7 trillion economy by 2030 would unleash multiple vectors of growth and prosperity. India's model of people-centric, technology-driven, and women-led development would radiate peace and stability in our region and globally. Above all, it would prioritize what has hitherto been the neglected priorities, voices, concerns, and interests of the global south. Optimism of India's future also rests in our resolve not just to be a global manufacturing center, but also a hub of high-tech skills that could drive the next epoch of information technology revolution. And I'm using the word epoch very, very consciously and carefully. It is also underpinned by our determination to effectively respond to threats to our security. But India would not be a free rider of the global system, nor bystander to global challenges. We would instead be a proactive partner in seeking solutions and resolving them. Let me close by expressing our shared confidence that over the next couple of days, Chaturanga of Raisina 24 would engage, deliberate, provoke, ask tough questions, all in our common and collective quest for solution to the challenges that we face and pathways that we could chart as we look at the years ahead. On that note, I welcome you all to the inaugural dinner of Raisina Dialogue 24. Enjoy your meal. Bon appétit à tous. Merci. Thank you. Namaskar.
As the Foreign Secretary had alluded to in his speech, in this long decade, which is in its fourth year, we've already seen three large disruptions, domains of disruptions. Peace and security clearly being one of them, and we are seeing conflicts all around. Some could argue the fact that we are not able to intervene and manage these conflicts is a symptom of the failure of international institutions that were meant to ensure peace and security. We have seen stresses in terms of economic crises and the management of the pandemic and beyond, affecting countries, deeply affecting countries. We've also seen the idea that good economics is good geopolitics, or vice versa, good geopolitics is good economics, is now only a dream. And today they have been divorced. People truly believe that politics and economics can be pursued separately, which is leading to perhaps a frailty in the globalization project, in the project of the last century, which believed that we could be better together. And of course, finally, we have technologies that are challenging the old arrangements, domestic arrangements, international arrangements, and partnerships are difficult to fashion that can respond to these fast-moving and dynamic innovations that require both internal and international responses. And to discuss some of these and more, I want you to help us all get down that line of thinking that could lead us to a better tomorrow. So let me start with Minister Janena from Panama. Let me, in some sense, as we miss the heydays of globalization, we must realize that Panama was peak globalization. Its role, its place was defined by the success of that global project. Sitting where you are today, how does the world look to you? How does that global project look to you? Opportunities, concerns, challenges, what really?
Thank you very much. You see, I think you're asking the right person, because Panama has benefited so much from globalization. In fact, the Panama Canal concept, it's quite an interesting idea of globalization. It was conceptualized by the French, built by the United States, with labor from many parts of the world, including Asia, and currently administered by Panamanians. Mm-hmm. The world trade has impacted us positively, and that has definitely impacted our economy and stability. You can see also we are one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America, good inflation, low rate inflation. But again, the challenge of globalization is that for Panamanians, we need to maybe increase the lines of trade in the matrix of, global trade that are currently passing through the Panama Canal. And for Panamanians also, the concept of globalization means connectivity. Our country has been conceptualized as a canal country. But in fact, if you see Panama in the map, you will realize that we are not only a passage or a choke point that unites the Atlantic and the Pacific, but we also are the connection between North America and South America. And geographically, we are Central American, but let's say historically, we are South American. Culturally, we are Caribbeans, and we are the only country in the mainland of the Americas that has shared history with the United States for almost 100 years. So the way we see ourselves is only connectivity, and globalization is part of our DNA. It is important for us to encourage and, let's say, champion those countries, emerging powers like India, for instance, Brazil, Indonesia, that are going to play a very important role in the new routes of supply chain and the new routes of trade. And it's also very important for us to coordinate with countries that have special situations like Panama, administer choke points like us, and administer fresh waterways like the Panama Canal. So in a nutshell, I think globalization will transform. I mean, globalization is part of our DNA. It's very important for Panama, and it's our best interest to encourage the idea of globalized trade and open supply lines of logistics.
I'm going to come back on trade in a little bit, but thank you for your initial response. Can I turn to the minister from Ghana, ma'am, and ask you a similar question? The world seems to be retreating from a wholesome embrace of trade integration. Ghana and other countries in your region seem to be actually now working towards greater integration. You have a larger project, and you are championing the revitalization of the Commonwealth as a grouping that could perhaps also play a key role in the project in the future. What is it that we should be learning from you that makes us positive about this embrace of integration?
Thank you very much. Globalization basically should bring us together for benefit. And that's what we all seek to do when we join multilateral organizations or when we seek partnerships. However, equity is not what we experience. And I'm speaking from the point of view of a developing country. Ghana is a middle-income country. It's part of ECOWAS. It's part of the African Union. We have been able to come together as the African Union to form a free trade area. We started trading. Before the free trade area, it was quite difficult to see countries within Africa trading amongst themselves. It was much easier to trade with the outside world, outside Africa. Today, we've started trading. There are some hindrances that we are working at in terms of transportation and free movement and stuff like that. So I believe that globalization is for good. However, we need to ensure that the equities that are needed for countries such as those in the South, Ghana, Africa, to benefit needs to be looked at. And that's where we have the issues with the WTO, World Trade Organization, that we are trying to ensure that it does not feed into what we are doing as Africa. Now, going to the Commonwealth, I think that one thing that we should be looking at as Commonwealth countries, if Africa has been able to come up with the African Continental Free Trade Area, the Commonwealth countries, 56 countries, should look at a free trade area where the developed and the developing countries can trade amongst themselves, can invest in each other's countries, because it is only then that we will be able to develop our countries. And there is so much potential. We have not even scratched the surface. We talk about a 2 trillion trade amongst Commonwealth countries that we haven't even started. We're all shying away from that particular conversation, but I think the time has come for us to look at that particular trade issue amongst Commonwealth countries, because my president always says one thing: no country can develop through aid. It is only trade and investment that can develop a country. There are many countries developing in the Commonwealth that need to industrialize. There are parts of the Commonwealth, and I believe about 52% or so have a population of under 30%. It means that we need to educate our youth. We need to create jobs for them, and that can only be done through trade and investment.
So in many ways, the SDG agenda is intimately linked to a more forward-looking trading part.
Very much so, very much so. I'm not too sure whether we are doing well with the SDGs at this point, with all that's happening around us and the global scene. But I think that if we would focus, it will go a long way to ensure that we alleviate poverty and gender issues, blue economy, and so on and so forth, all the 17 objectives.
Minister, let me ask you a slightly provocative question. While you are a leader in a dynamic country that looks at the world in a certain way, how did the pandemic, the conflict in Europe, now the conflict in the Middle East, change the view of the people in your country and in the neighborhood towards multilateralism and multilateral institutions? Do people still believe in it? Or is there a cynicism?
I think there's more of cynicism than a belief in it. But we cannot lose hope where that is concerned, because no country can live in isolation, survive in isolation. We all need to belong. But what we found out with the crisis in Ukraine, we thought, oh, that's somewhere in Europe, so far away, has nothing to do with us. We woke up one day and realized that most of our cereals and grains come from there. Steel comes from there. And then it affected our oil prices, affected prices of food. And then we began to realize that we are very much interlinked. And therefore, as much as coming out of COVID, where we felt that we had been isolated, so to speak, because the countries that produced vaccines had to have their fill of it, ensure that their citizens were very much protected before taking some outside. But then they quickly came to realize that if they did not take care of all others, because we live in a global village and there's movement of people, people were going to move, and all the work that they've done, all the success is chalked in terms of making sure that they're all vaccinated, it would come to naught. So I think that in that respect, people were very cynical about the whole multilateralism. But I believe that there's no other alternative than to belong. And so as much as it's not 100%, it's not perfect, we need it, and we must try and make it perfect.
Minister Gobind, I'll come to you with a slightly different variation on the same question. Island states, small countries are facing the triple threat of stressed balance sheets, of negative impacts of climate change, and a global disinterest in coming to assistance or putting together arrangements that can help you guide it. So, globalization that is failing, balance sheets that are stressed, and a planet that is angry, island nations are facing the brunt of it. How are you looking at globalization, global partnerships now? What are the new opportunities? What are the challenges?
Thank you, Samir. I think first of all, I should say, after listening to James, I'm beginning to feel dark matter flowing through my body. Well, through your question, if I can take you back to the pandemic period, life was going on in the fast lane, and it all came to a sudden stop. And you had to ask yourself certain existential questions then. How did it all happen? Where do we go now? To whom do we turn to? Globalization suddenly meant absolutely nothing. For once, as an islander, you realize that the remoteness that was your disadvantage for trade during COVID became your advantage for being protected. But even that did not protect us. And during COVID, you had to think very quickly. You had to think who would come to your rescue. I say it again, globalization really meant absolutely nothing. I personally witnessed an event, a very unfortunate event at an airport, where our freight guys were picking up certain medical equipment on the tarmac to put on a charter plane to bring to Mauritius, and it was grabbed by a bigger muscle guy from a bigger muscle country. That was, I think, that summarizes the situation in which small island states were. And I think it's the time that we forged other partnerships, which are becoming perennial now. One of those strong partnerships was with India. Many countries had the benefit of the Covaxin, delivered to the doorstep, because there were no airlines or shipping companies willing to take the vaccines. We didn't even know where they were made. So you had your own homegrown indigenous vaccine. You could have kept it for yourself. Minister Jaishankar traveled even during restriction, February 2021, yeah? And sooner rather than later came the vaccines. With the vaccines came partnership, not only for Mauritius, but for so many other countries. Globalization took a different angle. The unfortunate thing that is happening now is that as humans, we tend to forget. We are committing the same mistakes. We are rushing back into the fast lane, perhaps heading towards chaos. I hope, I pray we are not going there. But when I listen to James, you want to make a bigger collider. You want to create, in fact, chaos out of a particle hitting another. I don't know what will happen. But when you look at globalization now, you kind of see organized chaos in different parts of the world. And we're asking ourselves the same question that we were asking during COVID. To whom do you turn to? What will guide your voting pattern in your multilateral institution? And why? And what will be the consequences of that? We are, I think, at the crossroads where we need to find some order in this chaos. I think that, is the existential question that we are having to answer collectively. And it's not an easy task, because you need to foresee what your decision today will deliver tomorrow. And the existential question now, when you mention climate change, this is a question of survival. I don't need an expert to come and tell me that climate change is happening. I remember the beaches on which I was playing football when I was at school. Those beaches are minimum half gone, if not totally gone. You can visit Mauritius and I will take you around anytime to show you what it was when I was a kid And in the same lifetime, I'm not talking of a generational change, you actually see the effect of sea level rise. So that's a question of survival. There is another question of survival that is happening, and allow me, when you mentioned earlier, Samir, the question of the technological advancement. We are moving so fast today. I think this has the technological advancement has the potential of shaking the very foundation of our democracy. Because of the influence of social platforms and digital platforms has on our democracy through election time. You imagine what is the influence of certain digital platforms on the minds of people. And if that influence happens on the day of election, what is the consequence of that? I know for you, India, you're having elections spread over weeks, but not all countries have elections spread over weeks. Elections happens in a day. And if you're having elections more than in, what did you, I heard almost 70 countries this year, it will take perhaps 4 or 5 CEOs of the 7 biggest tech companies to, out of their own agenda, or out of just curiosity, or out of just being high on substance, wanting to influence elections in a particular country. It's a question of survival when it comes to a small jurisdiction.
True.
So this survival, I think, is, and it's all coming at the same time, and it's not easy task to answer these questions.
So I'm now going to pose a question each to the last 2 speakers this evening, and then I'm going to ask you all for a 1-minute second question on one good idea that we should be pursuing to take the world to a better space in the days ahead. But first, let me turn to you, Peter. In retrospect, it seems that the high tide of globalization was 2 decades ago, with London one of the capitals of that particular moment. Many countries, including, I would dare say, from your region, have retreated from the commitments of that particular period. Most visible being a post-Brexit UK itself. From you, I would like to know that are we drawing the right lessons from the successes and then the failures of globalization that have ensued in the last couple of decades? And what should be done to improve on them or correct those? Global Britain, a project that was launched a few years ago, is perhaps meeting a world that is no longer that global. So what should be the new format for a country like yours? Commonwealth could be one of those, clearly. But what could be other formats for a country like yours to recatalyze economic integration?
Well, I don't think that Britain is any different from Mauritius, Panama, Ghana, or Australia. We live in the same interdependent world. We live in a world that is characterized by exposure to and dependence on trade as a driver of growth and as a distributor of prosperity. It's also a world which, during the last 2-3 decades, has seen a boom time in trade and growth and prosperity, which, yes, has seen many corporate profits fattened dramatically, but has also seen global poverty halved. That is quite an extraordinary achievement for a world trade system which has been underpinned by a system of rules, overseen by an extraordinary organization, the WTO, the only international organization of its kind which not only sets rules, but also has the means to resolve disputes between its members, to enforce its rules, and to punish those who defy them. If only the United Nations organization itself
were quite so effective. And it's therefore a calamity, in my view, that we should see the decline of the WTO, its rule book, to see a situation in which its appellate body, the only body able to operate effectively, that judicial system, that dispute settlement system, now disabled by the refusal of the United States to allow new judges to be appointed. Why is the United States acting in this way? It's doing so because it believes that the multilateral system, the WTO, is not a fit and proper body to enable countries and members of the WTO, like the United States, to take on countries, notably China, which in its view is freeloading on the system, taking advantage of its weight and its power in the international trading system, and not playing fair by anyone else. And it believes that the multilateral system is, in a sense, constraining the United States or holding back the United States in its ability to deal with China in that way. Now, I would much rather, of course, the United States come to the conclusion that rather than viewing the WTO as an organization that is constraining it, and therefore should be disabled, that it should instead look to the WTO as an organization that needs strengthening, that needs its rule book updating, that needs its machinery sharpening, so as to take on trade, what it regards as unacceptable trade behavior by one of the WTO's other leading members, notably China. But that's not the situation that we're in. And I think this speaks to something which is really has become sort of quite chronic in the international system, and that is the conclusion reached by those who are most powerful in the international system to ignore its rules, jettison its machinery, not bother working with and through the institutions that it has created, but instead deciding that it has no alternative but to use its weight regardless of those rules and regardless of those institutions. And the losers from this are going to be literally everyone else, including, I might say, those larger countries, those weightier economies, who don't feel they're getting the deal that they want from the international system, because at the end of the day, what all this will mean is a net aggregate loss in growth, prosperity, well-being, a smaller aggregate global cake that we could and should then divide in a fairer and more equal way amongst all the players in the global economy. But that's not the route along which we're going, I'm afraid. What we see is trade growing relatively amongst those countries that agree with each other, and not with those countries that are not of a similar or like mind. In other words, we're creating new geopolitical fault lines through the global economy and the international trading system. We're not deglobalizing, we are reglobalizing in a way, in my view, which will be unfavorable to economic growth in the world as a whole and will lead, as I say, to deterioration in everyone's well-being, whether they be rich or relatively poorer.
Minister Koh, let me turn to you. Minister Gobind had mentioned, had briefly alluded to technology and its power to disrupt dramatically arrangements within countries and across the globe. How do you view technologies and digital platforms reshaping societal and national arrangements, especially in a country that was built through a multicultural, immigration-based design. So how do you see the impact and implications of these technologies on your society and societies like yours?
Well, the first thing I'd say is taking that approach about looking back to look forward is that I don't think it is useful to look at technology as this is digital technology that just started from 2010 or from 2020 and that somehow this is all new from that point going forward, and that actually a lot of the issues that we feel like are impacting on the current global order from technology are things that we've seen come about from the Industrial Revolution onwards. Everything was a new technological development that had a disruptive effect that resulted in change and upheaval and people resisting that and trying to feel their way forward. And I just think it's important to have that longer view construct when we're looking at what is the impact of technology. But I think to go to the specifics at the end of your question, Australia likes to regard itself as one of the most successful multicultural nations in the world, and I think that's true. And one of the things that I think has allowed us to be successful is that we have not been about homogeneity, we've been about celebrating diversity and allowing and celebrating that diversity. But what we have seen of late is that the way in which modern social media and communication technology allows the world to be completely integrated also means that whereas in past decades diasporan communities may move into other countries, be it Australia or other places, and very much leave whatever may be internal discord from the place that they've left where they were and to become well settled, the potential for those disruptive effects of past conflict at home travel much more quickly into the new country that they call home and can result in some degree of, not necessarily replication, but can disturb social harmony that we all want to see in all of our countries. And equally, the way in which diasporan communities are treated in particular countries, if that's negative, can flow straight back into their former home country and result in negative diplomatic engagements with countries. And that's something we need to be very alive to because of the way in which communication can happen so quickly when we're trying to make sure, and going back to your previous point about, you had a question about to what extent do our people think about the United? No one thinks about the United Nations at home, but they're constantly thinking about how they're engaging with their own diasporan community or their home country in a much more ready sense. And so the way in which then we as governments and countries deal with that locally becomes incredibly important, because when we get that right, it allows us to have much more social license within our own domestic communities to engage properly in multilateral dialogue and discussion and to make sure that everybody is benefiting together.
So how do we change this interest or lack of interest in global institutions or global conversations within our community? How do we bridge that distance? I mean, how do we have to give up some efficiency gains of purely transactional economic trade relations and try and make it more appealing? How do we do it?
I think one of the things that we've seen, and particularly in a post-COVID world, and we talk about the long decade. I mean, 2020 was the longest decade all on its own. But I think, how do we address that? One is that we do need to make sure that we are coming out of that, all of the disconnect that happened, especially the supply chain shock that came out of COVID, meant that I think countries rightly are much more concerned about their own local economic resilience and their capacity to do things a bit more on their own. But we should not see that as necessarily having to disrupt that diversity of economic engagement as well. And in fact, what we see from Australia is it's actually focused not just governments, but certainly there is a public conversation that is had about the importance of economic diversity. And that's about industry types as much as it's about country to country relationships. And if there's And that actually, I think, supports a multilateral approach and supports a globalisation where it's not just about being too reliant on any one relationship or sets of relationships, but people see the resilience that comes economically and therefore geopolitically by having a broad suite of good functioning relationships, and that benefits both from a security point of view and from an economic point of view. And people feel that.
You want to come in very quickly?
Problem is that people are confusing economic resilience and security with economic nationalism. Or put it a different way, they are seeking economic security by means of economic nationalism, and that is what is the, in a sense, the dagger to the heart of our international system and the interdependence from which in trade, from which so much growth and prosperity has been created.
Unfortunately, there are no free lunches, but also no free dinners. So, like I promised you at the very beginning, I'm going to ask you all to give us one good idea to pursue this year that will make the world a better place. So I'm going to first turn to my favorite minister, Minister Janena, to come up with that. That's why I called you my favorite one, because I was going to come to you. So,
understand.
Minister Janena.
But I need you to, I would like to explain this very quickly, but for instance, we are living in a,
You'll come close to the mic so that...
in an interconnected world. It's impossible not to cooperate. It's impossible not to have global action. I'll give you what is for me the biggest achievement, diplomatic achievement of my country, the Panama Canal Treaties, very quickly. During that time, the Cold War, the leadership of my country analyzed the state of the world and understood that the Panamanian cause had to be internationalized in order to get the canal back. We did three specific things that were very important. First of all, Panama managed to take the Security Council, the United Nations Security Council, to Panama City. It was the second time that Security Council would meet outside New York City, and the first time in Latin America. It was because of the canal, the contention we had with the United States. The second thing was the fascinating relationship between Omar Torrijos and Tito from Yugoslavia, and the mentorship that he was giving to him to get the canal back. And the third thing that was very important was the performance and the help that we got from the non-aligned movement to push and put pressure on the United States so we could get the canal. At the end, we got the treaties. The day that the treaty was signed in Washington in the OAS, Torrijos made sure that all the leaders of the Americas were present, no matter the ideology. Because that was an achievement not of Panama, but the Latin America and the world, as the canal served the world. So 3 lessons I think that are very important in today's world is that we need to align the goals to the reality, so we can really craft a strategy that is effective. If we do that, then I think whatever is next and the mentorship, the share of knowledge should be there, and the ideology, circumstantial ideology, should not be on the way to achieve and manage success.
So we got 3 instead of 1, thank you. But let me now turn to the Minister from Ghana. Ma'am, one big idea to take forward, besides the Commonwealth.
I think what's important really is that we need to see reforms of the international organizations, the international institutions, the United Nations, the Security Council, because it is so unfair that 5 countries, we are in post-World War II. The situation then is not what exists now. And you cannot imagine that Africa is not at the table. India is not at the table. Countries like Brazil, Japan are not there. We just got off the UN Security Council, and many of the issues had to do with Africa. And yet Africa is not there, but is only there we're there as non-permanent members. I think it is wrong. The World Bank, IMF, I believe they are moving in the right direction. There's been some reforms, and therefore the way they engage is even different from what it used to be. So I believe reforms is very important. Another thing is how multinationals deal in our countries. That needs to change. It really needs to change because we are being shortchanged. Raw materials are being carted out in raw form. And if you take Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, the two countries account for 60% of world cocoa. And yet, we earn about 7 billion. This is a 120 billion market in total. Most unfair. So the raw materials are carted, raw cocoa beans are taken out, turned, produced into chocolates and brought back to us. This is not right. We need to be able, we need fairness. Cost of capital, that's one area that needs to be looked at. Because Africa, I'm using Africa as an example because that's where I come from. Cost of capital, we are seen as risk, a high risk continent. And therefore, when we go to the bond market to borrow, it's so expensive, whereas other countries in our same category borrow at less. And that's not a fair system. That needs also to change. So there's quite a number of things that I believe that should change so that we have some level of equity to be able to develop.
You know, I heard someone say recently, and I repeated it in one of the other conferences, investing in Africa is not risky. Not investing in Africa is risky. And I think that's something we should get our minds around. But let me turn to you, sir. Maybe one good idea to take forward. Everyone is giving me 3. You don't have to feel the pressure.
I'm not going to give you 3. I'm just going to endorse what you've just said, which is that we do need a fundamental overhaul of the international system, of the multilateral system. That system and its institutions were designed and created, yes, both to put into effect universal values and human rights, but also in the way in which, in some respects, the system operated as a reflection, yes, of Western prerogatives and Western priorities. So instead of sort of trying to sort of defend against all the odds an international system that was born in 1945, we need to adapt, modify and reform a system that's more relevant to today. I do think that starts with the United Nations. I do think it starts with the Security Council. I'm sorry that a country like China should set its face against reform and that overhaul. I also find it incredibly dispiriting and demoralizing that we have sitting on the Security Council of the United Nations a country like Russia, which is fighting a colonial war against a European country and people. It comes from a mindset of a man, Putin, which is completely imperialist. He doesn't believe that Ukraine as a country has a right to exist, doesn't think that the Ukrainian people should enjoy freedom and democracy. He believes that Ukraine and its people should be folded back into a post-Soviet empire, a greater Russia.
Peter,
and I wish my great idea is for everyone in the United Nations, including the countries of the so-called Global South, to rediscover the ideal of anti-colonial solidarity and show very, very firmly indeed their position against an imperial war in Ukraine, and so that they stand absolutely foursquare behind people who are fighting for their freedom and their democracy.
I want to respond, but I won't. I mean, okay, let's move to the next one.
You want to make the case
no,
for colonialism?
I'm not want to. I don't want to make a case. I just want to say it's kind of ironic where it comes from. That particular intervention. It would have possibly suited Minister Gobind to be saying that, and not necessarily a lot from UK. But so be it. But let me turn to Minister Gobind. Minister Gobind, your big idea for the next year.
Just a parenthesis. Territorial integrity should apply equally to the Chagos archipelago. Territorial integrity should not apply with one set of rules in a particular area of the world and not apply with the same set of rules for the area of the world. So coming back to your question now, Samir.
One big idea.
One big idea is reform, and I say this because there is no trade without peace. If the Security Council was created to maintain peace in the world, and they can no longer maintain peace, whether it's between Russia, Ukraine, or in the Red Sea, or in the Middle East, or elsewhere, I think they should take a hard look at themselves. And if you can't do it, if you can't do your homework, seek help. Reform yourself. And the same applies to the African Union. We also have a Peace and Security Council. We are three of us, Shirley, myself, and a brother from Tanzania. We should take a hard look at ourselves as well in the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. If we can't maintain peace, there will be no trade. That is a fundamental sine qua non. So this reform is in the interest of global trade. Civilizations are based on movement of people and goods. So this is one. And second thing I think is we should recognize the increasing importance and role of non-state actors. The international economic order or the multilateral system is based on states as actors. But non-state actors, and I'm particularly referring to transnational corporations and big tech companies, are the mighty players on the international scene, and we should reckon with them. And so we should adapt the rules. There should be accountability mechanism with them. There should be supranational institutions. If, for example, the individual human rights of a citizen is being trampled upon and the state does not react, you have supranational bodies which come into play. Do we now have these supranational institutions and fora when it comes to non-state actors? We still don't. I think this also should...
So the ungoverned space that is beginning to define our lives, how do we respond to
Oh,
that?
yeah.
Final word
Thank
to
you.
the Australian, then I'm sure it's going to be about cricket. We are going to win the next series.
Well, as a country that was intimately involved in the creation of the United Nations, I was going to talk about that, but that thunder's already been stolen. So,
Correct.
you know, this is the problem of being the last person to come up with a new idea. So I'm just going to make this observation, which is that to achieve all of these things and to avoid, you know, ultra-nationalistic versions of trade and disconnection from the world order and the countries that we desperately need to follow the rules, having them follow the rules, and to encourage that outcome also means that everybody needs to look within themselves around their own social inclusion. Everybody needs to benefit from trade and multilateralism and the benefit from these organisations. And Peter made a really good point about halving world poverty. And at a statistical level, there's amazing outcomes, what we've achieved in the second half of the 20th and early 21st century. Amazing outcomes. But lots of people still feel that they haven't benefited from that. And the more that we see that, the more difficulty that causes in countries being able to fully participate and show the benefit of their participation in a global trading system and a global system that's trying to work together. And when we're focused on positive outcomes instead of sharing the blame for past activity and past events, then we have a platform to move forward. And for countries to be in a position to do that, making sure that everyone within those countries share the benefit. That's not about holding anybody back. It's making sure everyone has the opportunity to see those boats rise. And as a country that is completely reliant on and committed to trade for its prosperity and sharing that prosperity, having a rules-based order and having people understand that they benefit from that and they need to benefit of that within their own nations as well, that's how we can have everyone positively disposed.
Thank you so much, Minister Ko, and I think that brings to end this very interesting conversation. 5 very interesting viewpoints. Please join me in applauding the interventions this evening. Plenty to talk about, and Lord Mandelson and I are certainly going to have a conversation over dinner. So thank you so much.
Can
for
we
joining
watch?
us. Thank you.